The blue Dodge van slowed as it passed the bus stop on Helena's west side. November 1978 brought an early winter to Montana, and the young woman huddled inside the shelter, arms wrapped tightly around herself. When headlights illuminated her face, she looked up with the desperate hope of someone who had been waiting too long in the cold. The van stopped. A window rolled down. A conversation occurred that no one would document for nearly 9 years. Montana winters held secrets well. The vast expanses between towns, the snowdrifts that could conceal anything until spring, the cultural tendency toward privacy and self-reliance, all created perfect conditions for a pattern to develop unnoticed. Between 1978 and 1986, women disappeared from bus stops, roadside diners, and shopping center parking lots across western Montana. Local authorities investigated each case in isolation. The disappearances occurred in different counties, with different detectives, different file systems. The pattern remained invisible. In a split-level ranch house 15 miles outside Missoula, Raymond Mercer, name altered, maintained an ordinary existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable but pleasant, a man who worked at the state transportation department, kept his lawn mowed in summer, and always cleared his driveway promptly after snowfall. He attended occasional community functions, but never stayed long. People remembered his van more than his face. The blue Dodge was distinctive in a town where most drove trucks or four-wheel drive vehicles. Mercer had purchased it used in 1977 from a dealership in Billings, paying cash from savings accumulated over years of living simply. Mercer's childhood had been spent in various foster homes across the Pacific Northwest. School records indicated average performance, with teachers noting his unusual attention to detail and preference for solitude. After high school, he joined the military but received a medical discharge following what records vaguely described as adjustment difficulties. He moved to Montana in 1975, seeking quiet and space. The state provided both in abundance. Inside his home, invisible to neighbors and co-workers, Mercer maintained a different kind of order. The basement had been methodically divided into storage sections, each meticulously labeled. Court records would later establish that he spent nearly $300 on specialized shelving units from a hardware store in Butte. The receipt, eventually found in his meticulous filing system, became evidence item 347. Among his various collections, fishing lures, road maps, vintage Montana license plates, one remained hidden behind a false wall he'd constructed with surprising craftsmanship. The first disappearance that would later be connected to Mercer occurred on November 12, 1978. Catherine Downing, name altered, age 24, missed her shift at a Helena diner. Her roommate reported her missing after 2 days. Police reports indicate standard procedures were followed: interviews with friends, family, and co-workers, checks of hospital admissions, inquiries about whether she had mentioned plans to leave town. Within weeks, the investigation slowed. By January 1979, Catherine's file had joined dozens of others in the cabinet of open but inactive cases. 4 months later, on March 3, 1979, Lisa Marshall, name altered, age 27, disappeared from a shopping center parking lot in Deer Lodge. Her car was found properly parked, locked, with no signs of disturbance. Her purse was on the passenger seat, containing $47 in cash. The only unusual element was a blue fiber found on the driver's side door handle, which was collected but not analyzed until years later. Like Catherine's case, Lisa's investigation eventually stalled. During this period, Mercer's work evaluations noted his reliability and punctuality. A supervisor commented on his exceptional record-keeping skills and recommended him for a position managing the department's inventory system. Mercer declined, preferring to remain in his field position that required regular travel throughout western Montana. The department's maintenance records would later establish that he logged more miles than any other employee during 1978-1986, despite having a territory no larger than his colleagues. The blue Dodge van became Mercer's signature, without investigators realizing it. Between 1978 and 1986, witnesses in 4 different towns reported seeing a blue van near locations where women later reported missing. In Missoula, a gas station attendant remembered a clean blue van with Montana plates, purchasing fuel late on the evening before Diane Keller, name altered, disappeared in October 1980. In Helena, a motel owner noticed a similar vehicle parked overnight in his lot, though no one had registered as its driver. In Great Falls, a blue van appeared in the background of a tourist's photograph taken near the spot where Rebecca Wilson, name altered, was last seen in May 1982. These scattered observations remained disconnected until much later. Mercer's pattern developed distinct characteristics that would eventually expose him. He selected women who were alone in transitional spaces, bus stops, parking lots, roadside locations. He approached them with a specific question about directions. Establishing a brief conversation, he offered rides on cold or rainy days. Once in his van, victims encountered a meticulously organized interior, with maps arranged by county and tools stored in labeled boxes. This attention to order extended to every aspect of his methodology. What investigators couldn't know, and what Mercer never revealed even after his capture, was how he selected his victims. Journal entries found during the search of his home suggested he followed an internal system known only to him. One partially decoded page contained what appeared to be a list of criteria, including details about footwear. This peculiar focus would eventually provide the key to connecting the scattered cases. By 1983, the disappearances had not yet been linked, but the frequency increased. Between January and November that year, 4 women vanished across western Montana. Law enforcement resources stretched thin across the vast state, with each jurisdiction handling its own investigations. The breakthrough came not from police work, but from journalism. Sandra Harmon, name altered, a reporter for the Helena Independent Record, began researching a feature article on missing persons in Montana. She created a simple database, entering information about every reported disappearance in the state over the previous decade. When she sorted the entries by date, location, and victim demographics, a pattern emerged that had escaped official notice. Harmon published her findings in February 1984 in a 3-part series titled Montana's Missing. The article suggested connections between at least 7 disappearances between 1978 and 1983. Law enforcement initially dismissed Harmon's work as sensationalism. The FBI's newly established behavioral science unit in Quantico had begun promoting the concept of serial offenders, but many local departments remained skeptical. Montana State Police Lieutenant James Garrison, name altered, was an exception. After reading Harmon's articles, he requested files from each jurisdiction where similar disappearances had occurred. Working after hours, using his kitchen table as an impromptu analysis center, Garrison identified additional commonalities that even Harmon had missed. The key wasn't what was found, Garrison later testified. It was what wasn't found. None of the missing women's shoes were ever recovered with their other belongings. This detail seemed insignificant until Garrison interviewed a witness who had seen Catherine Downing, the first victim, shortly before her disappearance. The witness specifically remembered Downing's distinctive burgundy loafers, purchased during a recent trip to Seattle. When Garrison reviewed witness statements from other cases, he found similar mentions of footwear. Lisa Marshall had worn new hiking boots. Diane Keller had splurged on Italian leather pumps. Rebecca Wilson had characteristic white nursing shoes. In April 1984, Garrison convened an unofficial task force, inviting detectives from each jurisdiction with similar cases. Meeting in a conference room at the state police headquarters in Helena, they created a comprehensive timeline and map of disappearances. When the locations were plotted, another pattern emerged. The sites formed rough circles around Missoula, with the radius gradually expanding over the years. As the task force worked to identify potential suspects, routine police work in Bozeman added another piece to the puzzle. On May 17, 1984, Officer Teresa Mendez, name altered, responded to a reported burglary at a shoe store. Security camera footage showed a man methodically examining women's shoes before selecting several pairs. The store owner found the behavior suspicious enough to review the tape after discovering the rear door's lock had been tampered with, though inventory revealed nothing missing. Officer Mendez included the incident in her daily report, which was distributed to departments statewide as part of a new information-sharing initiative Garrison had implemented. Garrison immediately requested the security footage. The video quality was poor, but the suspect's deliberate movements and attention to the shoe's details matched the methodical nature of the disappearance cases. More significantly, a blue van appeared in exterior footage from the shopping center's parking lot camera. Though the license plate wasn't visible, the timing aligned with the shoe store incident. Through spring and summer of 1984, the task force compiled a list of potential suspects, men with access to vans, histories of suspicious behavior, and connections to the areas where women had disappeared. Raymond Mercer's name appeared on the list based solely on vehicle registration records, showing his ownership of a blue 1975 Dodge van. His name was one of 73 requiring further investigation. The breakthrough came through methodical work rather than a dramatic revelation. Task force members divided the suspect list, conducting background checks and discreet surveillance. Detective Paul Riker, name altered, from Missoula County, took the section that included Mercer. His initial findings seemed unremarkable: a state employee with no criminal record, stable employment, and typical financial patterns. Then Riker discovered something odd in Mercer's work records. His travel reimbursement form showed he had been in the vicinity of 3 disappearances on the exact dates they occurred. The coincidence warranted closer attention. Riker began surveillance of Mercer in September 1984. For weeks, he observed a routine so predictable it could have been scheduled by computer. Mercer left home at precisely 7:15 each morning, arrived at work by 7:45, took lunch at 12:30, and returned home at 5:20. On Tuesdays, he stopped for groceries. On Thursdays, he visited the library. On weekends, he performed home maintenance or occasionally drove to a lake north of Missoula, where he sat in his van, apparently watching birds through binoculars. The pattern shifted on October 12, 1984. Instead of returning directly home from work, Mercer drove to Butte, approximately 120 miles from Missoula. Riker followed at a distance, observing as Mercer parked near the bus station and remained in his van for nearly 3 hours, watching passengers arrive and depart. When a young woman emerged from the station after dark, Mercer started his engine. Before he could approach her, another car arrived to pick her up. Mercer turned off his engine and resumed waiting. Riker, recognizing the predatory nature of the behavior, requested immediate backup and authorization for a traffic stop. Before additional officers could arrive, Mercer apparently abandoned his vigil and began the drive back to Missoula. Riker maintained surveillance, following Mercer's van through the mountains. Near a rest area on Interstate 90, Mercer suddenly pulled over. Riker, unable to stop without revealing himself, drove past and turned around at the next exit, losing valuable minutes. When he returned, Mercer's van was still at the rest area, but Mercer himself was nowhere visible. Protocol dictated that Riker should wait for backup before approaching, but concern for potential victims prompted him to investigate immediately. The van's windows were tinted, preventing clear view of the interior. Riker approached cautiously, identifying himself as police. When he received no response, he tested the driver's door and found it unlocked. The van was empty, its interior immaculately organized with custom shelving and storage compartments. A road atlas lay open on the passenger seat, with several locations marked in red ink. Before Riker could investigate further, movement near the rest area's bathroom building caught his attention. Mercer was walking back to the van, alone. Seeing Riker, he froze momentarily, then continued forward with deliberate calmness. Their conversation, recorded in Riker's report, revealed Mercer's extraordinary self-control. Mercer: "Is there a problem, officer?" Riker: "Just checking if everything's all right. It's late to be stopping here." Mercer: "Bladder won't make it all the way to Missoula. Getting older, you know how it is." Riker: "Where are you coming from this time of night?" Mercer: "Work meeting in Butte. Quarterly regional staff thing. Boring but mandatory." Each response came without hesitation, maintaining steady eye contact. Riker noted that Mercer's hands remained still at his sides. No nervous movements, no shifting weight from foot to foot. Without probable cause for search or arrest, Riker could only issue a warning about safety at rest areas after dark. Mercer thanked him politely, got into his van, and drove away. The encounter convinced Riker that Mercer warranted closer investigation. He submitted a formal request for a search warrant based on the coincidences in Mercer's travel records and his observed behavior at the bus station. Judge Eleanor Simmons, name altered, denied the request, citing insufficient evidence and concerns about privacy rights. Riker was forced to continue surveillance while building a stronger case. Through late 1984 and early 1985, task force resources dwindled as other cases demanded attention. Riker continued monitoring Mercer when possible, documenting his movements and researching his background. The pattern of disappearances slowed, whether because Mercer sensed surveillance or for reasons of his own remained unclear. For 8 months, no new cases matching the established pattern emerged in western Montana. Then, in August 1985, Karen Phillips, name altered, age 23, disappeared from a highway rest stop near Deer Lodge. A truck driver reported seeing her speaking with a man beside a dark-colored van shortly before midnight. Phillips' backpack was found in the women's restroom, containing personal items and a bus ticket to Seattle. The rest stop's location fell directly on Mercer's regular route between Missoula and Butte. The task force reactivated, focusing intensely on Mercer. Garrison successfully petitioned for electronic tracking of Mercer's work vehicle, arguing that state property used by a state employee during work hours carried reduced privacy expectations. For 60 days, Mercer's movements were recorded by a primitive but effective device magnetically attached beneath the van. The data revealed troubling patterns. Mercer frequently deviated from his assigned routes, taking unexplained detours down remote roads before returning to main highways. He often stopped at the same locations, particular rest areas, specific overlooks, certain gas stations, without logging these stops in his work reports. Most significantly, he made regular trips to an area near the Continental Divide, a location not included in his work territory and never mentioned in his meticulous personal calendar. On October 29, 1985, Judge Arthur Riley, name altered, granted a search warrant for Mercer's home, vehicle, and the mountain location he frequently visited. The operation involved 28 officers from multiple jurisdictions, coordinated to execute simultaneously at all 3 locations. Mercer was detained at work, away from any weapons or evidence he might destroy. The search of his van revealed nothing immediately incriminating, just the extreme organization already observed, with tools, maps, and emergency supplies neatly arranged. The mountain location proved more significant. In a small clearing accessed by a barely visible dirt track, officers discovered a recently disturbed area of ground, approximately 3 feet square. Excavation revealed a metal box containing personal items later identified as belonging to Rebecca Wilson, who had disappeared in 1982. At Mercer's home, investigators found the evidence that would ultimately secure his conviction. Behind the false wall in the basement, officers discovered a room approximately 12 feet square, its walls lined with custom shelving. On these shelves, arranged in precise alphabetical order by what appeared to be first names, stood 43 pairs of women's shoes. Each pair was cleaned, polished, and positioned exactly parallel to the shelf edge. Below each pair, a small handwritten card listed a date and location. Further search of the room revealed journals documenting Mercer's activities in meticulous detail. He recorded encounters, conversations, and the specific elements that had drawn his attention to particular women. The most disturbing aspect of the journals was their emotional detachment. Entries read like scientific observations, devoid of either empathy for victims or pleasure in their suffering. One recurring phrase appeared at the conclusion of entries describing disappearances, added to the collection. Mercer offered no resistance when arrested. His only recorded statement at the time was, "The collection is complete now anyway." During subsequent interrogations, he maintained the same controlled demeanor Riker had observed at the rest area. He answered questions factually, but without elaboration. When asked about his motivation, he reportedly said, "It's about the order of things, not about the things themselves." The trial of Raymond Mercer began on April 7, 1986. Prosecutors charged him with 7 counts of first-degree murder, though investigators suspected his actual victim count might be higher. The evidence presented included the shoe collection, journal entries, items recovered from the mountain location, and forensic analysis linking fibers from his van to clothing worn by victims. The blue fiber found on Lisa Marshall's car in 1979, preserved but previously unanalyzed, matched material from the van's interior. Psychological evaluations described Mercer as having a sophisticated organization system that extended to every aspect of his existence, including his criminal behavior. Experts testified about his extraordinary compartmentalization abilities, which had allowed him to maintain a seemingly normal exterior life while systematically hunting and killing. The courtroom remained silent as prosecutors displayed photographs of the shoe collection, each pair representing a life methodically taken and catalogued. During the 6-week trial, Mercer sat calmly at the defense table, occasionally making notes or whispering to his attorney. He displayed no visible reaction to testimony, even when family members of victims addressed the court. His own testimony, when finally offered, focused primarily on correcting what he perceived as organizational errors in the prosecution's timeline. This peculiar focus on administrative details, rather than the substance of charges against him, reinforced the psychiatric assessment of his detachment from normal emotional responses. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. On June 24, 1986, Judge Margaret Keene, name altered, sentenced Mercer to death by lethal injection, the method that had replaced hanging in Montana in 1983. Her remarks addressed both Mercer and the families of his victims. The methodical nature of these crimes, the careful planning, and the complete absence of mitigating circumstances leave the court no alternative but the maximum sentence permitted by law. Mr. Mercer organized his crimes as he organized his life, with precision, deliberation, and a complete disregard for human dignity. No punishment can restore what the families have lost, but the court's sentence affirms that even the most carefully constructed patterns of evil will eventually be discovered and dismantled. Raymond Mercer remained on death row at Montana State Prison for 11 years. During this time, he continued his pattern of meticulous documentation, filling dozens of notebooks with observations about prison routines and fellow inmates. He filed precise, technically sophisticated appeals that delayed his execution. In the end, it was not the state, but his own physiology that ended his life. On February 3, 1997, he died of an undiagnosed congenital heart defect. After Mercer's death, investigators continued to connect additional cases to his activities. The final count reached 11 confirmed victims between 1978 and 1985, with another 6 cases considered highly probable but never conclusively linked. The blue Dodge van that had carried him through thousands of Montana miles was eventually destroyed, though not before yielding additional evidence that helped provide closure to victims' families. The shoes remained the most disturbing element of the case. Following conclusion of all legal proceedings, family members were offered the opportunity to reclaim these last possessions of their loved ones. Some accepted, seeking any tangible connection to those they had lost. Others declined, unable to separate the items from the horror of how they had been obtained and preserved. Those unclaimed were eventually destroyed by court order. Time reveals patterns invisible in the moment. The case of Raymond Mercer illustrated how ordinary systems, county jurisdictions, case filing methods, department boundaries, created blind spots where extraordinary evil could operate undetected. It also demonstrated how small details, like missing shoes, could ultimately expose what those systems had missed. The Montana wilderness still holds its secrets, but the pattern Mercer created through it has been permanently broken. What remains is not the methodical collection he assembled, but the human connections he never understood. Family members who continue to gather on anniversaries, detectives who still send holiday cards to victims' parents, journalists who revisit the case to ensure its lessons aren't forgotten. The true pattern was never about shoes arranged alphabetically on shelves, but about communities across Montana who refused to allow the silence of remote places to become the final word. These patterns of human resilience have outlasted the patterns of predatory behavior. Long after the legal files were closed and the evidence archived, people gather annually at a small memorial garden in Helena where 11 trees stand in a circle. Each tree bears a small plaque with a name. No shoes are displayed, no horror is commemorated, only lives remembered beyond the manner of their ending. This too is a pattern, one of remembrance and meaning-making that extends beyond the calculated order of a killer's mind. It remains the final word on the case that once haunted Montana's highways. Winter in Montana had always seemed almost sentient to those who endured it. The way the cold infiltrated buildings, the peculiar silence that fell with heavy snow, the isolation it imposed on communities already separated by vast distances, all created a psychological landscape as forbidding as the physical one. For the detectives who continued investigating long after the headlines faded, this element of the natural environment became impossible to separate from the case itself. The winter of 1985-1986, as they prepared for Mercer's trial, brought record-low temperatures across the state. Many noted the symmetry, the coldest winter in decades, coinciding with the revelation of crimes characterized by their emotional frigidity. The psychological profile developed during pre-trial preparations attempted to map the interior landscape of Mercer's mind. Dr. Elizabeth Harding, name altered, a forensic psychiatrist who interviewed him 14 times, described his consciousness as a series of hermetically sealed compartments, each meticulously maintained and seldom allowed to interconnect. She testified that his organizational system served a dual purpose, maintaining control over his environment while simultaneously imposing distance between himself and the emotional reality of his actions. The alphabetization wasn't arbitrary, Dr. Harding explained to the court. It transformed individual human beings, with all their messy complexity, into components within an orderly system. Once reduced to elements in his collection, they lost their humanity in his perception. The prosecutors built their case methodically, mirroring the organizational precision of the defendant. Assistant Attorney General Thomas Wilkins, name altered, established a chronology using Mercer's own journals, cross-referenced with work records, witness sightings, and disappearance reports. The pattern that emerged showed an acceleration over time, 8 months between the first and second victims, 6 months to the third, narrowing to roughly 10-week intervals in 1984 to 1985. Psychologists testified that this compression of timing typically indicates an offender becoming more consumed by his compulsions. The defense, led by public defender Margaret Swenson, name altered, faced the overwhelming challenge of representing a client whose actions seemed indefensible and who showed little interest in his own legal fate. Their strategy focused on Mercer's mental state, arguing that his extreme compartmentalization and obsessive organization represented a form of mental illness that precluded full legal responsibility. Swenson presented evidence from Mercer's childhood, psychological evaluations from foster care, reports from school counselors noting his difficulty connecting with peers, military records documenting his adjustment issues. One particularly significant document emerged during this phase of the trial. A military psychologist had noted in 1973, subject demonstrates unusual fixation on orderliness. When barracks inspection identified his footlocker as exemplary, subject displayed more authentic emotional response than observed in any other context. Recommend channeling this organizational tendency into appropriate military specialization. Mercer received an honorable discharge despite the adjustment issues referenced in later documents. His military file contained recommendations for civilian employment in inventory management or logistics, along with notations about his exceptional attention to detail and ability to maintain precise records. These seemingly positive attributes would later enable both his state employment and his undetected criminal activities. The prosecution countered the mental illness defense by highlighting Mercer's extraordinary capacity for planning. State Police Lieutenant James Garrison testified about Mercer's case calendar, recovered during the house search. The document detailed potential targets, surveillance schedules, and even weather forecasts for areas he intended to visit. This level of premeditation, Garrison told the jury, demonstrates clear understanding of both the nature and consequences of his actions. As the trial progressed, media coverage intensified. The case resonated nationally, tapping into growing public awareness of serial predators. FBI profilers from the relatively new behavioral science unit at Quantico requested permission to interview Mercer for research purposes. Judge Keene denied these requests until after sentencing, concerned that additional interviews might interfere with trial proceedings. Outside the courtroom, the communities affected by the killings struggled to integrate the revelations into their understanding of the world. In Missoula, where Mercer had lived unnoticed for years, neighbors expressed the now familiar refrain of disbelief. He was so normal, always polite, kept to himself but would wave hello. A gas station attendant who had served him weekly for 9 years told reporters he always asked for a receipt, even for small purchases. Should have known something wasn't right about that kind of precision. The trial revealed Mercer's extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization extended to his home as well as his mind. Crime scene photographs showed a house of two realities. The main floor presented immaculate normality, furniture arranged at precise angles, kitchen appliances positioned with mathematical exactitude, bookshelves organized by both subject and author height. Nothing suggested criminality. Even knowing what lay hidden in the basement, investigators initially experienced cognitive dissonance when moving through the conventional rooms above. The basement told a different story. Beyond the false wall lay not only the shoe collection that had made headlines, but an elaborate record-keeping system documenting each disappearance. Investigators found carefully maintained files containing newspaper clippings about the women's disappearances, notes on police activities observed in the areas afterward, and maps marking locations relevant to each case. Most disturbing were the surveillance journals, detailed accounts of women Mercer had watched but ultimately not taken. These potential victims, completely unaware of their brief candidacy for his collection, numbered in the dozens. During the penalty phase of the trial, family members of the victims provided impact statements. Their testimony stood in stark contrast to Mercer's detachment, raw emotion against calculated precision. Catherine Downing's father described how his daughter had been saving for graduate school, keeping her tip money in a jar labeled "Future Anthropologist." Lisa Marshall's hiking partner spoke about the wilderness conservation project they had planned to complete together. Karen Phillips' mother brought her daughter's journal, reading entries that captured the young woman's hopes for her new life in Seattle. These testimonies transformed the narrative from a clinical case study to a human tragedy. The alphabetized shoes on Mercer's shelves became reconnected to the lives they represented. Judge Keene specifically referenced this reconnection in her sentencing statement. The court has heard who these women truly were, their dreams, their relationships, their plans for futures that were stolen. No organizational system, no matter how meticulous, can reduce human lives to collectible objects. After sentencing, as appeals proceeded through the system, investigators continued examining evidence from Mercer's home. Among the most puzzling elements was a collection of road maps covering Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and eastern Washington. The maps contained highlighting in 3 different colors, with dates noted in the margins. Detective Paul Riker spent months cross-referencing these markings with known disappearances and Mercer's work travel records. This analysis eventually led to the identification of 3 additional victims in Idaho, whose disappearances had not previously been connected to the Montana cases. The blue Dodge van, perhaps Mercer's most important tool, revealed its secrets slowly. Forensic techniques were still developing in the mid-1980s, but advancements during the appeal process allowed for more sophisticated analysis of fibers, hair, and minute blood traces found in the vehicle. The van's interior had been modified with custom features that facilitated Mercer's activities: specialized lock mechanisms, soundproofing materials, and storage compartments concealed within what appeared to be standard vehicle features. Most significant was the discovery during a third forensic examination in 1989 of a hidden compartment beneath the van's floor. This space, accessible only when the passenger seat was removed, contained a notebook with entries dating back to 1976, 2 years before the first known Montana disappearance. These writings suggested Mercer's activities might have begun earlier and covered more territory than initially established. However, the notebook contained only planning and surveillance notes, without the confirmation of additional victims. While Mercer's appeals moved through the courts, FBI analysts studied his case as part of their developing methodology for understanding serial offenders. Their assessment identified several factors that had allowed him to remain undetected for so long: his occupation providing legitimate reasons for travel, his unremarkable appearance and demeanor, his residence in a state where population sparsity and jurisdictional fragmentation complicated investigations, and his extraordinary self-control, which prevented the escalation in risk-taking or sloppiness often observed in serial offenders over time. Special Agent Robert Crawford, name altered, of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, later cited the Mercer case in training materials. The subject demonstrates that organization itself can become a pathology. The same traits valued in many professional contexts, attention to detail, systematic thinking, methodical record-keeping, were weaponized in service of predatory behavior. This presents a detection challenge, as these characteristics don't align with our cultural conception of criminal deviance. The victims' families formed a support network that evolved into an advocacy organization. The Mountain States Victims Coalition, established in 1988, lobbied for improved cross-jurisdictional communication among law enforcement agencies and created a scholarship fund named after the 11 confirmed victims. Their annual remembrance walk through Helena became a tradition that continued long after media attention to the case subsided. In prison, Mercer maintained his organizational systems despite the constraints of incarceration. His cell became known among corrections officers for its extreme orderliness. He created elaborate scheduling documents for his daily activities, breaking each hour into 15-minute increments. He requested additional notebooks for his writing, producing what eventually amounted to over 3,000 pages of prison observations. These writings, analyzed after his death, revealed the same clinical detachment that had characterized his crime journals, now turned toward the microcosm of prison society. Mercer granted only one interview during his 11 years on death row. In 1991, criminology professor Diana Trent, name altered, received permission to speak with him as part of research on organized criminal behavior. Their conversation, recorded on 6 90-minute cassette tapes, contained what Trent later described as chilling insights into a mind that processed human experience as data points rather than emotional realities. During this interview, Mercer offered his only known reflection on the nature of his crimes. People misunderstand collection. It's not about possession. It's about creation. Building a system where each element has its proper place. The world is chaos. A collection is order imposed on a small section of that chaos. When Trent asked about the women themselves, Mercer's response revealed the profound distortion in his thinking. They became perfect once catalogued. Before that, they were just walking randomly through the world. I gave their existence a structure. This statement later featured prominently in textbooks on criminal psychology, illustrating the extreme objectification that enables certain types of predatory behavior. The heart condition that ultimately ended Mercer's life before his scheduled execution had gone undiagnosed despite prison medical examinations. The autopsy revealed an atrial septal defect, a hole between the upper chambers of the heart that had gradually enlarged over time. Medical experts suggested the condition might explain his lifelong aversion to physical exertion, his preference for methodical work over strenuous activity. Some speculated that awareness of his physical limitation might have influenced his methodical, low-energy approach to both daily life and criminal activity. After Mercer's death, authorities faced the question of what to do with the extensive evidence collection. The shoes presented a particular challenge. Their return to families reopened wounds for some. Their destruction seemed a final erasure of the victims for others. Eventually, following consultations with family members and victim advocates, a compromise was reached. The shoes themselves were cremated in a private ceremony attended by family representatives. The ashes were scattered at the mountain memorial site where the 11 trees had been planted. The case generated significant academic interest in the years that followed. Criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement trainers developed case studies based on Mercer's methodology and the investigative process that eventually identified him. The Helena independent record journalist who first recognized the pattern, Sandra Harmon, wrote a definitive book about the case titled Alphabetical Order that became required reading in many criminal justice programs. Her work emphasized how traditional investigative approaches had failed to connect related cases across jurisdictions, and how interdisciplinary collaboration ultimately proved necessary for resolution. One aspect of the case that received particular scholarly attention was what criminologists termed the invisibility of the ordinary. Mercer's unremarkable appearance, conventional occupation, and seemingly normal lifestyle had effectively camouflaged his criminal activities. This phenomenon complicated traditional approaches to offender profiling, which often emphasized behavioral or personality abnormalities visible to casual observation. The Mercer case demonstrated that extreme internal deviance could coexist with external conformity, protected by strategic compartmentalization. Lieutenant James Garrison, whose recognition of the missing shoes helped break the case, lectured at police academies throughout the Northwest until his retirement in 2001. His presentations emphasized the importance of questioning basic assumptions. We kept asking what was found at each scene, following standard procedure. We should have been asking what wasn't found. The absence of evidence became the evidence of absence. Those missing shoes told a story we almost didn't hear. The technological limitations of the investigation period, before DNA analysis, cellular phone tracking, widespread security cameras, or digital databases, made the eventual solution to the case all the more remarkable. Detective Paul Riker, who first identified Mercer as a high-priority suspect, later observed that modern investigative tools would likely have connected the cases years earlier. Today, we'd have cellular data placing him near the scenes. We'd have DNA from the victims. We'd have database software identifying the pattern across jurisdictions automatically. Back then, we had paper files, landline phones, and Sandra Harmon's remarkable insight. Harmon's role in the case influenced discussions about media law enforcement relationships. Her methodical research had identified a pattern that official channels missed, demonstrating the potential value of journalistic approaches to complex cases. Yet the initial dismissal of her findings by some officials highlighted the tensions between these institutions. The eventual cooperation between Harmon and Lieutenant Garrison became a model for productive collaboration, studied in both journalism and criminal justice educational settings. The physical geography of Montana itself constituted a significant factor in the case. The vast distances between communities, the remote areas accessible by secondary roads, the severe weather conditions that complicated evidence preservation and recovery all created investigative challenges unique to the region. FBI analysis noted that Mercer had effectively exploited these geographical features, selecting victims and disposal sites with apparent awareness of how environmental factors would impede investigation. The seasonal rhythms of the state had influenced both the crimes and their investigation. Mercer's activity increased during summer months when more women traveled alone on Montana's highways. Conversely, investigation of remote locations became nearly impossible during winter, creating natural pauses in evidence gathering. The contrast between summer discoveries and winter delays created a pulsing rhythm to the case that stretched over years. During the decade following Mercer's death, advances in forensic technology enabled re-examination of evidence from his van and home. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, unavailable during the original investigation, confirmed connections to additional victims suspected but not confirmed during the trial. Soil samples from the van's wheel wells, preserved in evidence storage, contained mineral compositions that helped identify additional disposal sites in 3 counties. The psychological implications of the shoe collection continued to generate research and debate. Dr. Elizabeth Harding, who had conducted the pre-trial interviews with Mercer, published several papers examining the intersection of organizational compulsion and violence. She identified what she termed systematic predation, criminal behavior characterized not by emotional gratification, but by the satisfaction of imposing order on targets perceived as components rather than individuals. In Mercer's case, she wrote, the collection itself became the motivation, superseding any direct psychological or physical satisfaction from the acts of violence. The arrangement of shoes by first names represented a cataloging system that transformed individual women into entries in his personal inventory. This extreme objectification facilitated his compartmentalization, allowing him to maintain a functional public persona entirely disconnected from his criminal activities. The organizational capacity that made Mercer so effective at evading detection for years also generated detailed records that eventually ensured his conviction. The methodical documentation found in his home provided prosecutors with unusually comprehensive evidence. Assistant Attorney General Wilkins later noted the irony. His obsession with documentation created the most damning evidence against him. He recorded his own crimes with a precision that left no room for reasonable doubt. Mercer's childhood experiences, explored during the trial's penalty phase, suggested early development of his organizational fixations. Foster care records described a 9-year-old Raymond arranging his few possessions in elaborate patterns, becoming distressed when these arrangements were disturbed. A 7th-grade teacher noted his habit of alphabetizing everything on his desk before beginning work. Military training temporarily channeled these tendencies into approved structures. Before his discharge returned him to civilian life without the external ordering systems he had briefly adapted to. One foster parent, interviewed after the trial, recalled, he would line up his toy cars perfectly, exactly 1 inch apart. If another child moved one, even slightly, he wouldn't get angry. He'd just go completely still, like he was shutting down, then carefully put everything back in place. It was unnerving, that cold precision in a child so young. The question of whether earlier intervention might have prevented Mercer's crimes became a subject of debate among mental health professionals. The warning signs, extreme orderliness, social detachment, difficulty with emotional reciprocity, had been noted throughout his development but never triggered comprehensive treatment. Some experts argued that his case demonstrated the need for better integration of childhood observations into long-term mental health monitoring. Others cautioned against overstating the predictive value of traits shared by many non-violent individuals. The blue Dodge van, central to Mercer's methodology, represented both his public and private personas. To his neighbors and co-workers, it signified his reliability, always clean, well-maintained, appropriate for his professional role. To investigators, it eventually revealed itself as a carefully designed tool for predation. The vehicle was photographed from every angle before its destruction. These images later used in law enforcement training to illustrate how ordinary objects can be repurposed for extraordinary crimes. The van's destruction in 1998, following exhaustive forensic examination, occurred through controlled incineration rather than the standard crushing procedure for evidence vehicles. This decision came after consultation with victims' families, many of whom expressed discomfort with the possibility of components being recycled into other vehicles. A small ceremony preceded the destruction, attended by members of the investigative team and representatives from the Mountain States Victims Coalition. Detective Riker, who had first observed the van during surveillance, later described watching it burn as the final period at the end of a very long sentence. The geographical clustering of Mercer's activities around Missoula, with a gradually expanding radius over time, provided insights into his spatial awareness and risk assessment. FBI analysts mapped these patterns, creating a model that suggested calculated testing of boundaries, beginning in familiar territory, then systematically expanding as confidence grew. This model later informed investigations of other regional predators, helping authorities identify potential activity zones based on initial case locations. The seasonal and weather-related aspects of the case highlighted the challenges of rural crime investigation. Several potential burial sites identified in Mercer's journals remained inaccessible for months due to snow accumulation. The spring thaw of 1986 allowed investigators to locate 3 such sites, providing additional evidence during the appeals process. This pattern of seasonal access and limitation became a significant consideration in subsequent Montana investigations, with task forces developing specialized protocols for evidence preservation in extreme weather conditions. For the communities affected by Mercer's crimes, the aftermath extended far beyond the legal proceedings. Social workers in western Montana reported what they termed regional trauma, a collective anxiety that manifested in changed behaviors across communities. Women altered travel routines, parents implemented stricter monitoring of children's activities, and general vigilance increased. A university study conducted in 1988 found that 73% of women in the affected counties had modified their daily activities in response to the case, with changes persisting years after Mercer's incarceration. The case influenced regional infrastructure development in unexpected ways. The Montana Highway Department accelerated installation of emergency call boxes along remote highway stretches, a project previously delayed by budget constraints. Rest areas underwent redesign to improve visibility and safety. Bus stations implemented new security protocols, including improved lighting and regular patrol checks. These physical changes to the landscape served as lasting reminders of how the case had altered public consciousness about safety in spaces previously taken for granted. Helena's Memorial Garden, with its 11 trees representing confirmed victims, became a place of both remembrance and community healing. Annual gatherings there evolved from somber commemorations to celebrations of the women's lives and legacies. The Mountain States Victims Coalition established a tradition wherein family members shared stories about who these women had been beyond their tragic connection to the case, their ambitions, talents, humor, and relationships. This practice of reclaiming narrative from trauma became a model studied by victim advocacy groups nationally. The scholarship fund established in the victims' names supported women pursuing careers in criminal justice, forensic science, and victim advocacy. By 2005, More than 40 women had completed education partially funded by these scholarships. Several joined law enforcement agencies in Montana and surrounding states, creating a legacy of professional commitment emerging from personal tragedy. One recipient, who became a victims' rights attorney, noted at a scholarship dinner, "Their shoes were arranged alphabetically on his shelves. Our degrees hang alphabetically on our walls. This is how we answer darkness with light." For the investigators who devoted years to the case, its resolution brought professional validation, but also lasting psychological effects. Lieutenant Garrison, Detective Riker, and other task force members reported experiences common to those immersed in traumatic investigations: intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, occasional nightmares. Many sought counseling to process their experiences, a practice still uncommon in law enforcement during that era. Their willingness to acknowledge these impacts and seek assistance influenced departmental cultures, gradually reducing stigma around mental health support for officers. Sandra Harmon's journalistic work on the case transformed her career and influenced investigative reporting methodologies. Her systematic approach to organizing disparate information demonstrated the value of database thinking before such tools were widely available. Journalism schools began teaching what became known as the Harmon method, creating comprehensive information systems to identify patterns across apparently unrelated events. Her book about the case received a Pulitzer nomination and remained in print decades later, required reading in both journalism and criminology programs. The legal precedents established during Mercer's trial and appeals influenced subsequent cases throughout the Northwest. Judge Keene's rulings on evidence admissibility, particularly regarding items found behind the false wall, created standards for search scope that balanced thoroughness with constitutional protections. The Montana Supreme Court's decisions on his appeals clarified jurisdictional questions in multi-county cases. These legal frameworks provided structure for later complex investigations crossing traditional boundaries. The psychological reports prepared for Mercer's trial contributed to evolving understanding of compartmentalized criminal behavior. Dr. Harding's detailed analysis of his mental processes identified patterns later recognized in other organized offenders. Her work helped shift professional understanding away from a focus on criminal profiles toward more nuanced analysis of how cognitive structures facilitate certain types of behavior. This approach emphasized understanding not just who might commit certain crimes, but how mental organization enables their execution and concealment. In the decades following Mercer's death, advances in neuroscience offered new perspectives on the biological foundations of his behavior. Research on brain structure and function suggested potential neurological correlates for extreme compartmentalization and emotional detachment. While retrospective analysis could not confirm specific neurological factors in Mercer's case, his extensively documented cognitive patterns provided valuable reference points for researchers studying the intersection of brain function and behavior. The Montana State Archives established a special collection housing materials related to the case: investigation reports, trial transcripts, journalistic accounts, and academic analyses. This collection, accessible to researchers but carefully managed to respect victims' dignity, ensured that lessons from the case remained available to future generations of legal, mental health, and criminal justice professionals. The archival approach emphasized documentation of investigative methods and interagency cooperation rather than sensationalistic elements that had dominated initial media coverage. As information systems evolved, the case became an instructive example of how data integration might prevent similar investigative delays. The cross-jurisdictional challenges that had initially obscured the pattern led directly to development of Montana's Unified Crime Reporting System in 1990. This database, allowing agencies statewide to identify potential connections between local cases, represented an institutional response to the fragmentation that had benefited Mercer. Similar systems subsequently emerged in neighboring states, often citing the Montana case as motivation for their implementation. The story of Raymond Mercer and his alphabetized collection faded from national headlines relatively quickly, displaced by newer tragedies. In Montana, however, its impact persisted through changed practices, physical memorials, educational programs, and community rituals of remembrance. The case became part of regional consciousness, not defining the communities affected, but informing their understanding of both human vulnerability and resilience. For the families who lost daughters, sisters, and mothers, the alphabetical organization imposed by Mercer represented the ultimate dehumanization. Their ongoing work through the Mountain States Victims Coalition focused on restoring individuality to those he had attempted to catalogue, ensuring that each woman was remembered not as a component in his system, but as a complete human being with a distinctive life and legacy. This reclamation of narrative became their most powerful act of resistance against the objectification he had imposed. The memorial trees in Helena continued growing long after media attention to the case dissipated. Each year they added new rings, their root systems gradually intertwining beneath the soil, creating connections invisible on the surface, but increasingly inseparable below ground. Visitors to the garden often remarked on how the trees had grown together over time, their branches creating a collective canopy, while their trunks remained distinct. This living memorial, evolving through seasons and years, stood in contrast to the static arrangement Mercer had created in his basement, a testament to life continuing and transforming beyond the order he had attempted to impose. This narrative is based on archives and historical accounts. Some names have been altered. We seek to understand, not sensationalize. The outcome corresponds to public records of conviction. No graphic violence was described,